Somaliland waxay ku mahmaahdaa
walaadi nin bay dishaayay nin magasho
qofkii soo joogsan laga waayo soo jiifsaa laga helaa
marta ceelaliyo heshiiso ayaa reer maar cabbaa
nabad baa naasal nuuga leh
nabadda diidaa waan ku idhi turraantaana mooyaan
intay nabadi joogto ayaa nin waliba labana leegaya
cidla waxa la seexdaa adigaan cidi ku maagayn cuntana waxay macaan tahay adigoo caafimaad qaba
sow godobi surinkaad martaba sabab qarsoon maaha sow nabadi sahaydaada ood sidato uun maaha
nabad haddaad haysato wax kaa maqani maba jiraanba
Hargeisa, 1991. This is what's left after a decade-long civil war between the Somali National Movement and the Somali government forces. Hargeisa, 2007. A rapidly growing capital city of close to 500,000 people. The symbol of restored relations between communities affected by war. How were the people of Somaliland, a British protectorate until 1960, able to restore peace and stability? Equally important, how was a common political structure created in the face of such extremely difficult circumstances? This is a film that explores Somaliland's transition from active hostilities and war to peace and relative stability. The SNM was formed in London in April 1981 by a group of Isak intellectuals, professionals, and members of the country's armed forces. The movement established bases in Ethiopia in early 1982. However, it received very little other support from the Ethiopians, who were already backing another major Somali rebel group, the Somali Salvation Democratic Front. As a result, the SNM turned to clan elders and other traditional mechanisms for support.
The
elders came into this scene as a council the SNM founded. Initially, this wasn't a council for peacemaking. But the SNM rather founded this council as part and parcel of the movement, with the key role of mobilizing fighters, resources, and livestock. It was a council that was directly involved in the struggle.
We went to all of the subclans and asked them if they were willing to commit their weapons, livestock, and young men to the struggle. And they said they were willing. Then, as a delegation of nearly 500 men, we went to Farawayni, where we inaugurated ourselves as the Gurti, because designating a special Gurti for specific missions is a strong Somali tradition.
As a measure to halt opposition, in subsequent years, Bari's authoritarian regime carried out a brutal repressive campaign, particularly against the Isak subclan, who provided the main base for the SNM, many of whom were subjected to arbitrary detentions, torture, and at times, execution. Cliques and rivalries for the movement's leadership were common within the SNM's top ranks from the very start.
The SNM was born with disagreements. These differences gradually intensified. But this is not unique to the SNM. It's quite common in anything that people try to work out together.
In a nation that would be known as Somaliland, these rivalries would later infuse chaos. But as insurgents out there in Ethiopian training camps, the enemy was one. The mission was one. So for the SNM, solidarity was essential. As an armed resistance, the SNM was engaged in guerrilla-style combat against the Somali government forces for 6 years. In early 1988, however, Somalia's Bare and Ethiopia's Mengistu agreed to a peace treaty that was intended to end support for armed resistance on both sides. Therefore, having decided to launch an all-out war on government forces, the S&M invaded major government bases in Hargeisa and Borao. In retaliation, the government combined the use of heavy artillery and bomber planes to flatten most of Hargeisa and Borao. In many ways, this war wasn't a traditional Somali conflict.
There are two key differences. The first one, of course, being the fact that the conflict was over a state and the power that comes with it, which were both considered as resources by the opposing sides. Whereas traditionally, natural resources like water and grazing land were mostly the causes of conflict. The second difference is that traditionally, spears, swords, knives, bow and arrows were used by the opposing sides. But in the Somali Civil War, much more destructive weapons were used, of which the AK-47 was the smallest.
According to Africa Watch, over a 3-year period, an estimated 50,000 civilians were killed, while another 500,000 were displaced from their homes, with many fleeing to Ethiopia.
It wasn't just about the clan. It was really about the use of government power and resources against the interests and well-being of its own people, whereas in the old days, it was more of a clan-on-clan conflict.
It's 1991. The S&M was able to end the military regime of Siad Barre in the northern regions. The future looked uncertain. Non-Isak subclans were anxious to see what the triumphant and stronger S&M would now do. Some feared reprisals for supporting the defeated government.
It was a terribly worrying and emotionally intense period. All of the clans were in fear of each other. Naturally, everyone's biggest concern was revenge, and that was very intense.
The history of the Somali people is full of violent conflict and fierce confrontation. But whatever the source of the conflict or magnitude, it was always here, under the tranquility of a well-shaded tree, that elders patched up their differences, negotiated treaties, and cultivated peace.
Fortunately, the clans that were back in the S&M had already addressed this issue during their meetings prior to entering the country. They asked themselves what they would do if they ended up taking control of the country. They agreed that making peace with the other clans was the best thing for everybody. And so, they came into the country with that formula.
This was a prolonged war that had been going on for a while. All along during the conflict, structures and a kind of social order were taking form. These structures defined the roles of the different members of respective communities. It was this extensive conflict that had allowed the communities to mature and organize themselves when it came to making peace.
As it turned out, the S&M's long tradition of self-help and reliance on traditional mechanisms helped the movement to become accountable to a public.
The S&M took power as a relatively mature movement. And I think that understanding of political dynamics of the public, that interaction with other clans meant that the S&M was well aware that it could not govern, it couldn't lead, unless it was going to seek at least negotiate peace with the other clans in the territory.
Starting in Og and culminating in a decisive meeting in Berbera, the S&M took the first steps to end hostilities in the north through a series of local meetings and conferences between elders from all of the major Isak and non-Isak subclans. Remarkably, days before the collapse of Bari, northern clans were already engaged in dialogue. Formerly known as the Brotherhood Meeting of Northern Clans, the Berbera Conference was S&M sponsored. For the first time, delegations from all the clans of the then northern regions came together to collectively agree on an absolute ceasefire across the northern regions. Following this, starting in April 1991, all of the northern clans gathered in Borao with the intention of consolidating peace as well as discussing the political destiny of the northern regions with stronger emphasis on the representation and participation of all groups.
This is where, after the clan-based meetings concluded, the first National Assembly was held. Politicians, titled elders, and intellectuals from all of the clans from the north gathered here. This is where the resolutions and the declarations from the clans were transferred over to the S&M and its executive body for further discussions and approval.
The Burao meeting location was important because Burao was probably the best, most central place in a way, apart from the fact that Hargeisa was completely destroyed and full of mines. Burao was a place that also allowed the eastern clans to participate.
This was of particular concern because the defeat of the Somali army in the northern regions did not end hostilities in Sanag. Due to the diversity of its population, the conflict in the area was relatively more complicated than elsewhere in the northern regions. In fact, as members from the Harti subclans participated in the Boro Conference, some villages out east were under attack.
Sanag region is first of all a front line inside Somaliland. At the same time, you have a diverse mixture of Isaq and Darod subclans and sub-lineages living inside the region. For centuries, these subclans and sub-lineages have lived there together. But it was the civil war and its conflict dynamics that divided these communities, where one clan group supported the government while the other backed the S&M.
Sanag region has unique characteristics that put its communities at a high risk of conflict. Because of their very close ties and the huge legacy of disputes there, their clashes can be the ugliest of clashes. But it is these same characteristics that make it possible for Sanag communities to resolve their problems in the best of ways.
As a result, a swift transition from war and hostility to peace wasn't immediately possible here. And for some time, this threatened to undermine Somaliland's peace processes. This then prompted both the elders and the S&M leaders to address Sanag as a priority area in the Boro Conference.
In Burao, we all agreed to live peacefully among each other. We also agreed to reclaim Somaliland's sovereignty. As such, we agreed that all parties be given the opportunity to take part in the new government's different institutions. But at the time, the only organization that existed was the S&M. And since not all of the clans in the north were a part of it, we thought that it was important to incorporate these clans into the S&M's executive body and the national Gurti.
On May 18, 1991, the S&M Central Committee, supported by the elders representing all the major clans in the northern regions, declared the restoration of the Republic of Somaliland.
The issue of independence was contentious.